Oak Hill presents an unabridged recording of The Creature Keeper, written by Damaris Young and read by Annabelle Brooke. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Oak Hill. Chapter 1. The Letter. The letter arrived soon after the noises began. They were tied together, one and the same. "Read it out loud," I jiggled in my chair. "I want to know what it says." Pa read it slowly, his eyes flicking across the page. "Dear Mr. Irwood, I am writing to you with an offer of potential employment. I am currently seeking an apprentice to take over the role of caring for my menagerie at Direspire Hall. But be warned, the role is not suitable for just anyone. It requires skill, courage, and ingenuity. My collection houses extraordinary creatures who are intelligent and highly dangerous if not treated with the very best care. As creature keeper, you would be required to live permanently at Direspire Hall and would have to give up contact with anyone outside of Direspire Hall for the safety and well-being of my creatures. In exchange for your work, I offer a generous wage. I look forward to meeting you. Lady Cavendish of Direspire Hall." Pa put the letter down on the table. The room was silent for a moment, while we all absorbed the words. "A generous wage," Pa muttered. "Highly dangerous," Ma whispered. "Extraordinary creatures," I breathed. The thought sent a shiver of excitement through me. "What are extraordinary creatures like, Ma?" I asked. The sorts of animals we had around here were more of the cow and sheep variety. Although they were great in their own way, I didn't think that was what the letter was referring to. A frown creased Ma's forehead as she poured another cup of tea. "They are impractical," she said. "Now a dairy cow, that's a functional creature. You feed it and it gives you milk and meat." Milk and meat. I hated it when Ma and Pa referred to our cows like that. They were more than that to me. They were family. I ploughed on. "When was the last time you saw the extraordinary creatures, Ma?" Ma blew on her tea to cool it down. "I was only a young girl. Back then the Direspire Hall menagerie was open for everyone to see. Terrifying beasts they were. But then the accident happened, and after that the gates of Direspire Hall were shut and never opened again, thank goodness." A haunted look passed over her face. "I knew she was keeping creatures again. I just knew it. When did we first hear the noises, Arfan? A week ago or the week before? I thought the world was coming to an end." "It was the week before." Pa slid the letter back into its envelope. "The cows tried to break free through the fence. That would have been the last thing we needed if they got out." "I heard the noises last night," I said. "It sounded like—" I couldn't think of a good way to describe it, so instead I took a deep breath and roared, which sent Crabbit the cat skittering out of the open kitchen door. Ma gave me a cross look. "Really, Cora, it's too early for animal noises from you." I clamped my mouth shut. Sometimes words don't really express what you want to say, so you have to roar. "I thought you'd given up keeping dangerous creatures," Pa growled. "Something's got to be done about it." Ma and Pa never usually liked to talk about Direspire Hall, waving off any questions I had with, "That's all in the past," or "No need to bring up that unpleasantness." But I'd always been curious about the mansion and the moors. Direspire Hall had loomed large on the moors for as long as I could remember. I had felt its presence every day growing up, as if it had its own magnetic force that was pulling me towards it. Now the letter had confirmed the creatures were back, and Lady Cavendish was looking for a creature keeper. "What are you going to do about the job offer, Pa?" I asked. Pa folded the letter and put the still warm teapot firmly on top of it. "You wouldn't catch me taking on any creature-keeping role, not for the life of me. We've got enough on our plates dealing with the farm and our own cattle." Bella. That reminded me. Bella, our old dairy cow, had caught foot rot from the boggy fields and needed extra care at the moment. She was the oldest cow we had on the farm, and I'd grown up with her. I loved her with my whole heart. I grabbed a slice of toast and jumped up. "I'm going to see Bella," I told Ma and Pa. "Cora, wait. Sit down." Ma patted a chair. "We need to talk to you about Bella. It's important you listen carefully." My heart paused, and I felt dizzy. I sat down again slowly. "What's happened?"
"Bella's old and she's not well. We just don't have enough food for her. We have to think of the rest of the herd and ourselves."
Pa reached across the table, but I jammed my hands under my armpits.
"We can't keep her. I'm sorry, Cora."
Pa's words were a horse kick to my stomach. Before I could stop them, my words got jumbled up and stuck in my throat like thistleheads. "Not now."
"I'm sorry, Cora. I really am,"
Pa said gently. I shoved myself away from the table. "Don't start banging and crashing around, Cora." Ma put her hand on the chipped teapot. "You know we can't afford to keep feeding Bella. We have hardly enough to feed ourselves." She tightened her shawl against the early morning drafts that stole their way into the kitchen, despite Pa and me bunging up cracks in the crumbling walls with mud. "When you find your own path into farming, you'll understand." I jumped up and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. Outside, the mist smoothed out the edges of the barn so that it appeared to float. From inside I could hear lowing. Bella was waiting for me. I opened the door and mooed in greeting. Inside, the cow stalls were mostly empty, their occupants having been milked by Pa and let out to pasture before dawn, all except one. I filled a clean bowl with water and added soap. Unlatching the gate, I let myself into the stall. "Hi, Bella." The old cow turned her head towards me, but she didn't get up. Bella was disagreeable and bullish. She swung her head at strangers and bellowed at anyone who dared get in her way. She would stamp at Pa and Ma and Crabbit until they moved out of the way or let her be. But she would let me near her. I could talk to her without my words tripping on their way out of my mouth. Just seeing her made me feel calmer. I couldn't imagine being without her. "It's only me," I soothed. "You must be lonely all by yourself." Bella watched me with her brown eyes, as if to say, "What took you so long?" The fact she was still lying down worried me. Very gently, I unpeeled the bandages. Pa thought cows were for milking or meat, and a sick cow wasn't worth the milk. I wished he understood that they could be family as well. Bella understood. She talked to me in her own way, and it was easier being ignored in school when I had her to talk to at home. She was like a big sister. Better than a sister, probably. She didn't quarrel with me or pinch my books, which is what sisters were known to do. I'm sure I wouldn't like that very much, although having someone to share my books with would be nice, and quarrelling wouldn't be all bad. There must be lots of times that sisters agree and team up against their Ma and Pa. Maybe a sister would have helped convince Ma and Pa to keep Bella, even though she was sick, talking sense to them when anger stole my voice. "You're going to have to try a little harder to get better, Bella," I told her, with only a small wobble in my voice. I didn't want to frighten her. "Aren't you bored of staying inside? Don't you want to play in the field with your herd?" Bella gave an exasperated cough. With an effort, she tried to heave herself up before collapsing back onto the straw with a groan. "That was a good try," I said. "We can try again later, okay? Rest now." Her hoof was swollen and sore. I pressed the soapy cloth to it. "This might sting a little," I told her, "but it's for your own good." Bella flinched when the water dribbled over the swelling, but she watched me with her trusting eyes as I washed her foot with soap and wrapped it up again with a clean bandage. "I'll take care of you," I promised her. I curled up in the straw next to Bella and pressed my face against her warm neck. She rested her head on my knee with a groan. Being around Bella, I could think more clearly and untangle my thoughts from each other in a way that I couldn't with people. People just added to the knots in my brain, pulling and tweaking and snagging at my thoughts until my head was bunged up and I didn't know what to think about anything. Like with Ma and Pa in the kitchen. My words got jumbled up and I couldn't find the ones I needed to tell them how I felt. Besides, words were dangerous. They could be taken the wrong way or used against you. People relied on words too much instead of listening. Bella mooed, her breath sweet-smelling. I picked off the hay that was snarled in her coat. I'll find a way to help Ma and Pa look after you, Bella. Bella lifted her head and gave me a rasping, wet lick. Stop! I laughed and pushed her head gently away. I needed to go. I had to feed the other animals or I knew we'd be late for market. I'll be back later. I kissed her on her nose and tickled her ears before slipping her head off my knee and standing up, brushing the straw from my trousers. I could hear the chickens outside, cackling and scratching in their coop, grumbling at me to hurry up. I'm coming, I clucked back, which only got them crowing even more. I unlocked the door, and a flurry of feathers and snapping beaks erupted from the dark inside. Hello, Olive and Doodle and Queenie, I said in a sing-song voice, as each of them fluffed out their feathers and stretched their legs. I scattered their feed on the ground, and they squawked, pecking hungrily. I watched the chickens for a while, before sneaking back to the coop and opening the back door, stretching my hand inside and feeling around for treasure. There were 3 eggs, perfectly speckled and warm. Away from the chicken coop, there was a space where the grass grew tall and was allowed to seed. Untamed hedges and shrubs teemed with the sounds of birds. It was my favourite part of the farm, my wild place. Living on a farm, everything was done in a certain way and everything had its place. The cows were milked twice a day, every day. Once a week, we went to market in Hazelglen town and sold eggs and jam. There was a path that you followed. There was never any question of what I would be doing for the rest of my life, except milking cows and selling eggs and jam. Sometimes, in the middle of that overgrown space, I liked to pretend that there was another world, where adventure could be found and I could choose to follow any path I liked. I sat down, folding my legs beneath me, calming my breath until it was a whisper. All around me, the bees buzzed and insects hummed. A blackbird shrilled out its song, competing with a tiny wren's chirrup and a jackdaw's throaty call. I sat so still that nature forgot I existed and I melted into the undergrowth. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter from Direspire Hall. I wished it had been me who the letter had been addressed to. I loved learning about all kinds of creatures, discovering new species and studying their behaviour and the ways they communicate. Whenever I could, I would spend hours on the moors, watching the goshawks hunting on silent wings and the hares having furious boxing matches. The thought of spending my whole life caring for cows, only for them to be used for milk and meat, made me feel as though I'd fallen into a hole in the ground. I felt trapped just thinking about it. Sitting still was hard, especially when you felt as though your insides were full of jumping beans, but it was worth it. From the trees to the tiniest insect, there was never a quiet moment, though it was a different kind of noise to the world of people, where every noise had a purpose and meaning that was difficult to understand and interpret. I understood the song of creatures and plants. My quiet was rewarded by a tiny face peeking out of the long grass. Delighted, I watched as a mouse snuffled the chilly air, small black nose wriggling, its whiskers quivering. I took my notebook out of my pocket and quickly, trying not to move more than I had to, I drew the little mouse peering through the grass, its whiskers tiny strokes of the pencil. Then it was gone, scurrying into the undergrowth, only a shiver of grass to indicate where it had once been. If I was an animal, I would be a mouse. A quiet creature that is often overlooked, but who could sneak off for an adventure whenever it liked. Ma once told me that a group of mice was called a mischief, which made me love them even more. Mischief could mean so many things, being playful and naughty, but also upsetting the normal way of things, tugging at the thread and unravelling the order so that something new could be knitted. Cupping my hands around my mouth, I cawed loudly, aiming the sound towards the trees. With a familiar answering call, a shadow swooped from the gnarled apple tree. The crow landed on my arm with a heavy thump, and his claws dug into my wrist. One beady eye blinked at me. "Hello, wildling crow," I whispered. "I've brought you some breakfast." I cupped my hand and filled it with birdseed that I always kept in my pocket. I'd rescued Wildling Crow from Crabbit's jaws a few summers ago, and he repaid me by visiting every now and then. Wildling Crow pecked at the seed in my hand while I admired his glossy feathers and strong beak. Too soon, he took off again, his wing beats clapping loudly. Crabbit appeared from the long grass, his clever green eyes taking everything in. He was the king of the farmyard, stalking his kingdom with a snapping tail. He meowed and head-butted my arm. "Stay away from the wildling crow, Crabbit," I warned. "He's big enough to carry you away if he wanted to." Suddenly, Crabbit ducked low to the ground, his ears flat against his head. "What's wrong?" I said in alarm. A strange silence fell on the meadow. The birds stopped singing. Nothing moved. Then, out of that silence came a noise, a shrill whistle that set my teeth on edge. I looked up at the sky and caught a glimmer. A ripple in the air, like the shimmer on soapsuds. Was it? Yes, it was. The outline of a strange creature flying over the meadow, a shape with a long tail and bat-like wings. And then it was gone, disappearing as quickly as a bubble pop. The birdsong returned and Crabbit skittered away towards the cottage, faster than I'd ever seen him run. What was that creature? It had flown through the air like a swan, and was as large as one too. But it had been practically invisible, and now I was beginning to wonder if I'd imagined it. I decided to keep the strange sighting to myself, at least for now. There was no point in adding to Ma and Pa's worries. The sun seeped through my threadbare shirt and warmed my skin. Ma and Pa would be waiting for me. I didn't want to go back inside, where I knew they would be talking in hushed voices about all the things that troubled them, the failing crops, our crumbling home, our empty cupboards, and me, their strange, lonely daughter, who preferred talking to animals than people. I wish that they could see that just because I was quiet didn't mean I didn't have anything to say. Chapter 2. Market Day. The market smelled of pig fat. I could hear it sizzling from the stall that served crispy pork crackling to the hungry farmers and their families. Newly baked bread smell nipped my nose and my stomach. I tugged on Ma's sleeve. "Can I buy some bread?" After a moment's hesitation, Ma handed me a coin. "Get a ginger cake as well. We'll have it for tea." I ducked in front of a cart filled with pumpkins, narrowly missing getting run over, before stumbling into a flock of geese, earning myself a volley of wing blows against my legs. The herding dog barged me out of the way, skillfully taking back control of the birds. "Watch where you're going!" The farmer gave me a stern look. She whistled at the dog and swept past me. I recognised the strong whiff of compost and straw from the poultry farm. The baker's shop had a queue out of the door. I ducked around the back, down an alley between the cob houses, careful to avoid the mud puddles. I knocked on the wooden door to the baker's house, which was promptly flung open. A waft of cinnamon and butter swirled up my nose. "What do you want?" Etta, the baker's daughter, said in greeting, a smattering of flour on her freckled face. She crossed her arms against her apron. I managed to say, "I want to buy a loaf," before the words got stuck. I would have to leave the ginger cake for another day. I passed over the coin Ma had given me. Sometimes I played with Etta at school. She let me join in with her skipping rope games with her sisters. Other times she looked the other way when I waved at her. When my words got stuck, I tried to imagine people as animals or birds, which made it easier to talk. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Etta reminded me of a horse that had lived in the field next to our cows, which was friendly one moment but would try to bite your hand the next. Etta returned with a loaf of bread. I tucked it into my cotton bag. "Have you heard the news?" Etta dropped the coin into her pocket. "Bill's lost his sheepdog, Maisie, out on the moors. He's been looking for her for days." Bill was the shepherd who lived on the moors just outside the town. My heart plummeted. Poor Maisie. Pa didn't want us to have a dog. He said it would get in the way and be another mouth to feed. So I would visit Bill's and say hello to Maisie whenever I could. She was the sweetest creature. Her tail wouldn't stop wagging whenever she was in the company of her favourite people. She loved Bill, and he loved her like I loved Bella. He was her family. He would be devastated to have lost her. Bill said a loud noise scared her while he was herding sheep near Direspire Hall, and she bolted. Etta's eyes widened. He said it sounded like the Direspire monsters were back. I felt a shiver across my shoulders. I've heard the noises. They sound like... I tried to figure out how to describe the noises in words, but Etta wasn't listening. Bill said it was a roar that shook the ground and scattered the sheep every which way. Etta rubbed her nose. I always thought the place was empty. It looks like it's about to crumble into the moors. I wondered whether Etta's ma or pa had been sent a letter from Direspire Hall. Although, with them being bakers and not farmers, I guess they weren't the obvious choice for looking after creatures. Etta seemed to read my mind. I heard that some of the farmers are getting letters about taking up a job in Direspire Hall, but no one has taken up the job, not that I've heard of. Pa says nothing good can come of it. Last time there were creatures up there, someone got hurt. Something's got to be done before it's too late, she parroted her pa's voice. I heard Etta's name being called from inside the shop. She shook her head in annoyance, sending out a cloud of flour dust. "Bye, Cora," she said. I nodded goodbye and went to find Ma. The crowd had multiplied by the time I snuck out of the alleyway. There was a storm crackle of conversations in the air. Words like monsters and letter were on the tip of everyone's tongue, as well as darker whispers. I heard curse mentioned more than once. And I wondered if it was all connected to the last time that Direspire Hall was open to the public. I resolved to ask Ma and Pa about it again later. If Etta knew about it, why shouldn't I? Looking for Ma, I ended up bumping into the person I wanted to see least of all, Tilly. She was leading 5 of her friends through the crowd, sniffing out trouble. If Tilly was an animal, she would be a wolf, without the good bits. She was a leader who liked to prey on weaker creatures with a pinch of sharp fingers or a cruel comment. Everyone thinks Tilly is the toughest kid at school, but I knew she was scared of the rooster on her family farm. When we'd brought the chickens off Tilly's family farm, the rooster wanted to protect his hens, charging and crowing loudly, sending Tilly running back to the farmhouse. She'd been mean to me ever since. Her group of friends always followed her, shoving and yapping at each other, barging into bystanders. In fact, my whole school felt like a pack of wolves, and I was the only sheep. It was a relief now the summer holidays had begun, and I didn't have to go back to school until the autumn, when the growing season was over. I had the sudden urge to melt into the pavement, to make myself as small as possible, but Tilly had spotted me, her hungry eyes sharpening. "Beastie!" Tilly loped over. "What are you doing hiding at the end of the alley?" Her pack bayed with laughter. My cheeks flushed and I felt my skin prickle, but I didn't say anything. If a dog growls at you, you don't growl back. "Have your family got the letter yet?" Tilly grinned. I warned myself to be careful. Tilly was setting up a trap with her words, and I didn't want to fall into it. I held my tongue. "My pa got the letter yesterday, but we've no need for the extra money," Tilly said, with a half smile. Tilly's family owned poultry, and they kept the chickens squashed into small barns where they couldn't stretch their legs and wings. It was a prison, not a farm. Tilly cocked her head to one side, as if she just had a thought. "But I heard your cows are old and sickly, so you probably could do with the money, right?" I pushed my hands into my pockets as far as they would go. It was bad enough being taunted by Tilly, but it was even worse knowing she was right. Then, with a flick of her hair, Tilly grew bored with me. "See you in school," she sang, sweet as a kitten, and she skipped away into the crowd, her pack bouncing after her. I found Ma near the fishmonger's. I wrinkled my nose at the sharp smell of pickled herring. Ma was deep in conversation with Patty, the fishmonger. I dragged my feet, hoping to snag a thread of the discussion. "It's not right frightening folks, as if we haven't got enough on our plates already." Patty shucked open an oyster and sniffed it before discarding it in a bucket. "The whole situation just doesn't sit right with me," Ma replied. "She's got some nerve, keeping dangerous creatures in the heart of the community, then looking for someone from the town to do the dirty work. Who would want to work there after what happened all those years ago?" "I remember the accident as clear as if it was yesterday," Patty said. "Even then, I remember thinking Miss Cavendish was a strange one. She couldn't have been older than 13, same age as I was, but she never had any friends. Surly she was, ready with a glare but never a kind word." Ma shook her head. "Still, that young girl, having to bring herself up like that. We should have done more to help after her parents—" "It was their own fault for keeping the creatures in the first place. Accidents were bound to happen." Patty shrugged. "Besides, Miss Cavendish, or Lady Cavendish, as she is now, locked the gates. Direspire Hall is like a fortress. It was she who turned her back on the town." Ma spotted me. "There you are, Cora." She squeezed my arm. "I thought I'd lost you to the cakes at the bakery." She thanked Patty in her soft voice, and together we made our way through the crowded street. "What happened at Direspire Hall, Ma?" I asked. "Did a creature escape?" "I believe so, Cora. Somehow the creature, I think it was a large cat, rampaged through Direspire Hall, and 2 people got hurt, really hurt. It was a horrible thing to happen." "What happened after that?" "I don't know, Cora. The gates were shut that very same day. I heard Lady Cavendish got rid of all the creatures, and good riddance." I gripped hold of Ma's arm and used my body to barge through a knot of traders so Ma could get through. Since our cottage had started letting in the cold and the wet, Ma had grown frailer, and I was extra watchful over her in crowds. With so many farmers and fish folk around, it smelled like the fields and the sea had joined forces, an army of seaweed and salt and dung and mud. The sky was painted in spring blue, and the sun prickled my skin. People were dressed in colourful shawls and shirts, shrugging off the winter like a heavy coat. Somewhere in the crowd, a fiddler played a Harvest Day song, a lively tune that soared to the clouds and reminded me of dancing and bonfire smoke. I wondered if Lady Cavendish had ever visited the town on market day when she was a girl, or whether she'd been too busy looking after her strange creatures. Pa had set up his stall near the end of the town square. Since we were late this morning, it must have been the only space left. I felt a pang of guilt for staying so long in the meadow with Wildling Crow. The crowd was thinner here, halfway down the alleyway that smelled of old puddles and goose droppings. A rat skittered out at the corner of my eye before disappearing down an open grate in the road. "No one will want to buy jam with that smell," Ma groaned. Pa was deep in conversation with an old man who I recognised as Bill, the sheep farmer. His hat was pulled down over his white hair, and he wore 2 jumpers, even in the heat. He was the town gossip, and usually spent market day going from one stall to the next, fishing for new stories, with Maisie at his side, a busy, cheerful presence. But today, he seemed like a shadow of his usual self. "Good morning, Cora." Bill gave me a sad smile. "There's no Maisie for you to say hello to today, I'm afraid." I knew then that if Maisie was going to be found, someone had to go out and look for her. Someone who knew the moors, like me. I just had to wait for the right time to ask Pa. I couldn't bear for Bill to look so unhappy and for Maisie to be out there alone. Ma opened up the baskets full to the brim with jam jars and began to unload them onto the table. I helped her, while Pa and Bill carried on talking.
I turned around and she disappeared,
Bill said to Pa, shaking his head.
The noise had scared her away. It was like the devil himself had roared. It scared the wits out of me.
What noise? I looked up. What did it sound like?
A terrible sound out on the moors.
Bill's eyes widened.
A groaning, like the earth was waking up beneath my feet. Maisie took off and I didn't see her again.
I'm sorry to hear about poor Maisie, Ma said to Bill. I hope she comes home soon. She handed Bill a jam jar. Here, you could do with some cheering up and jam always helps. Bill pocketed the jam, thanking her with a sad smile.
I'm lost without Maisie. The sheep are scattered across the moors. I didn't dare search for her too close to Direspire Hall. I'm too old to be dealing with whatever monstrous creatures might climb over the walls in search of a good meal. Maisie has most likely got herself tangled up in some briars, Pa said to him. She'll work herself loose and will be home before you know it. It's that wretched Direspire. That place should be torn down. Who knows what dangerous creature she's keeping there now, and what if they escape again?
Bill shook his head.
It shouldn't be allowed. Families and livestock are at risk. In fact, this morning some of my sheep have already gone missing. Once I've brought the weekly shop, I'll head back out and continue looking. We can organise a search party if she's not back by tomorrow.
Pa brushed his beard with his hand.
I'll talk to some of the other farmers and see if they can spare a few of their scent dogs.
I could go and look for Maisie, I said. Please, Pa, let me try. I could go after market before it gets dark.
You won't go on those moors, Cora. Do you hear?
Pa growled. When he spoke like that, there was no arguing with him.
That Direspire Hall, it's not right.
Bill shook his head again.
If I had my way, the place would be searched and whatever abominations are being hoarded would be dealt with for the good of the whole town.
Dealt with? I didn't like the sound of that.
Something will be done about it soon enough, mark my words, Pa said. Things can't carry on the way they are.
Bill and Pa exchanged a grim look. Then Bill tapped his cap with his finger in a salute and said his goodbyes, walking back the way he came through the thinning crowd. My heart ached for him. I knew how much he loved Maisie, how worried about her he would be. I was worried too. It wasn't like Maisie not to come home. She knew those moors as well as Bill did. Something must have scared her badly, and it sounded like that something had come from Direspire Hall. Although it was quieter down the alley, there was still enough footfall to sell some of the vegetables and jam. With each purchase, I felt a tiny weight leave my shoulders. Morsels of conversation dropped from passers-by.
I took one look at the letter and tore it up, put it straight on the fire. Who does she think she is? A woman tutted, asking people to put their lives at risk.
It's shameful. You would have thought she would show a little more respect. Her friend shook her head. I rearranged the jam on the table, making sure all the labels faced outwards. The thought of Maisie lost all alone nagged at me like a splinter under the skin. Like Maisie and Bill, I knew the moors better than most people. I would spend all day watching the roe deer and waiting for a mole to surface, hunting for new territory. I knew I could find her if Ma and Pa would let me go. And if that meant getting closer to Direspire Hall, maybe even seeing what was inside, well, that couldn't be helped, could it? I was only aware of how quiet the alleyway had become when Ma grabbed hold of my shoulder, pinching it tight. She pulled me closer. A man walked towards us, with his arm in a sling, a bandage wrapped tightly around his upper arm, dark spots soaking through the fabric. He caught me staring, and his mouth clamped into a taut line. He scurried past. "Is he all right?" Ma hissed at Pa. "Should we see if he needs anything? Maybe some jam?" I hid a grin behind my hand. Ma thought jam could cure everything. Aching bones, sadness, and sore stomachs could all be solved with a spoonful of jam. But the man had already disappeared, slipping through the crowd that parted for him like wind through a cornfield. A moment passed, then the buzz of conversation started up. "Who was that man?" I prized Ma's fingers off my shoulder. "That's Mr. Johnson," Ma replied. "He works at Direspire Hall, but I've never seen him at the market before. He usually buys supplies for Lady Cavendish directly from the baker and the larger farmers." Ma tapped her fingers on the table, like she did when she was concerned. "Poor man, he looks awfully battered. Who knows what he has had to deal with behind the walls of Direspire Hall with those wretched creatures." Pa fixed his gaze in the direction the man had gone.
"There's no amount of money in the world that would get me to work at that cursed place,"
he said. Pa helped Ma up into the cart. She nestled up against the empty potato sacks and tucked her shawl around herself. She looked like a doll, her hair neat and her cheeks blossoming with the heat of the day's sunshine. "It's been a long day," she yawned, closing her eyes. We followed the trail back to our hilltop farm, as the sun melted in the horizon, a candle reaching the end of its life. With the oncoming night, my thoughts were drawn back to Maisie. I let the seed of a plan begin to grow in my mind. We reached the edge of the moor, where the grazing land turned to gorse and prickly heather. The clip-clop of Merlin's hooves softened on the grass, and I could hear the churring call of a grouse. If Maisie had been frightened, she would have sought out somewhere she felt safe, somewhere hidden. I'd spent so much time on the moors searching for the secret spaces to study creatures that I knew of lots of places where a lost dog might find herself stuck. Badger burrows and fox dens and gorse hideaways where sheep sheltered from the wind. I was engrossed in considering all the places Maisie might be stuck when we turned up the path towards home. Turning to face our cottage, I saw that something was wrong with its shape. It looked lopsided, as if it had lost its balance and couldn't get back up. Pa cursed under his breath. "What's going on?" said Ma sleepily. She sat up, patting her hair. "The roof," I said, a heavy weight on my chest. "The roof has collapsed." Chapter 3. Lost dogs want to be found.
"Keep out of the way, Cora, while we inspect the damage. The last thing we need is for you to get hurt," Pa sighed. "I'll call when it's safe to come indoors."
I was always needed out of the way. I was never in the right place at the right time. I wanted to help, but Pa had already turned his back and was conferring with Ma in low tones as they stared up at the sunken roof. I decided to see how Bella was doing. I led Merlin to his field before filling his feed bucket up. From there, I could see the moors stretching as far as the horizon, endless heather and bracken. A fog had started to roll in from the sea as the night took over. On a clear day, I could see Direspire Hall looming on the moors like a dark cloud, but the fog hid it from view tonight. That didn't stop me squinting into the growing darkness and imagining an escaped creature roaming loose on the moor. I shivered, half with fright and half with delight. I wondered whether I had imagined the strange bird in the meadow earlier, with its translucent bat-like wings and haunting whistling call. Tomorrow morning I would keep an eye out for it again. Leaving Merlin to his supper, I ran to the barn and swung the door open. "Moo!" I lowed, and 5 heads turned to face me. Petal, Pebble, Seashell, Bumblebee, and Bella. I ran to the last stall. "You're up!" I shouted. Bella snorted, her impatience confirming her wellness. Taking the rungs 2 at a time, I jumped over her gate. Bella was putting weight on her feet, all of them. Gently, I ran my hand down her leg, the one that had been so swollen and sore. It felt cool to the touch now, and Bella didn't flinch. I felt a swell of hope that even the worry of the fallen-in roof couldn't dampen. Did this mean that things might just be all right? I heard Pa calling for me, his faint voice heavy with tiredness. Back inside the cottage, I found that Ma and Pa had made a bed up in the living room for me, a mug of soup on the table for supper.
This is only temporary, Pumpkin.
Pa plumped my pillows and tucked the bedsheet around the mattress on the floor.
Things will be back to normal soon.
Ma and Pa said goodnight, taking their mugs of soup with them. Lying down on the mattress, I cuddled Crabbit close. He purred against my chest. I was relieved he hadn't been inside when the roof had fallen in. It was strange, sleeping in the living room. I could hear the drip, drip, drip of the tap in the kitchen and the groan of the wind down the chimney. It was dusty too. The thatched roof had fallen in over the back of the house where my room had been. Dust specks swirled in the stream of moonlight through the window like snowflakes. The thought of having a house with a broken roof when it did snow in winter was troubling. Could we fix it before then? I knew we needed everything we made at the market just to keep the animals fed and well, and while I was delighted that Bella had recovered, I was sure Pa would think only of the extra mouth to feed. Where on earth were we going to find the money to repair the roof? I turned it all over in my mind before I remembered. The letter. Generous wage, it had said. Pa had said he wouldn't go, but what if I applied? What if I could be the creature keeper of Direspire Hall? No, I was being silly. Why would the lady of Direspire Hall employ a child to look after her creatures? Crabbit hissed. He leapt out of my arms and scooted under the dresser. What is it, Crabbit? I sat up, throwing the bed covers off. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the window panes. The draught brought with it another sound, an animal howling. It's all right, I whispered. It's coming from Direspire Hall, too far away to be any danger to you. But Crabbit wasn't coming out from under the dresser. I thought of Maisie again, out on the moors, listening to the same howl in the wind. She would be so frightened. I slipped out from the warm nest of blankets and shivered as my feet touched the cold stone floor. Quick and quiet, I got dressed and eased up the window until the curtains formed ghosts in the chill breeze. From here, I could see the misty edges of the moor. Maybe I could look for Maisie now. Ma and Pa didn't have to know, not if I was back before dawn. As I walked past the kitchen table, I saw that the letter was where Pa had left it, under the teapot on the kitchen table. I tucked it into my pocket, my heart hammering. I felt horribly guilty. It was addressed to Pa, not me. I was only borrowing it, I told myself. I wasn't even sure why I was taking it. It was the middle of the night. It wasn't as if I could just knock on the door and ask for a job at 2 o'clock in the morning. Besides, finding Maisie was more important than all of that. I packed a torch, a portable lamp, my pocket knife and my notebook into my backpack and grabbed a jar of jam from the table and tucked it into the bag too. You never know when you might need jam. Ma always told me, and she was usually right. I clambered out onto the windowsill. It wasn't much of a jump. Our cottage was built low on the ground to protect it from storms, but still, I didn't want to crash the flower bed outside the window for fear of giving away clues of my nighttime adventure. I landed with a thump on the grass. Heart beating, I waited for a light to turn on, but the house stayed in darkness. I crept across the moonlit garden and eased the garden gate open, wincing at its squeak of protest at being woken up at this late hour. Luckily, the creak from the metal hinge joined in with the croaks from the speckled frogs in the pond near the barn. Once I reached the dirt road, I knew I was safe from being seen from the house. My pulse quickened, every smell sharper than in the day. Even the flowers smelt different, as if to attract otherworldly insects that only appeared at night. If I was caught, I'd be in trouble. Ma and Pa didn't like me going to the moors on my own at the best of times, and after what Pa had said earlier, I knew he'd be doubly angry. But Maisie was in trouble, and I knew I had to find her, then deal with the consequences. If a creature was in trouble, I had to help, otherwise it would eat me up inside. If Merlin was surprised to see me at this hour of the night, he didn't show it. He came over to the gate and nuzzled my shoulder. "Do you want to help me find Maisie?" I unbolted the gate and heaved it to one side. Merlin trotted out, lifting his feet up high. In the moonlight, his grey hair was almost silver, and he tossed his head as if he was a young horse again. I slipped the bridle on, not bothering with the saddle and stirrups. I stepped up on the bars of the metal gate and sprang onto Merlin's broad back. He skittered, then settled down. "Let's go," I whispered in his twitching ear and patted him on the neck. For an old horse, he seemed to come alive in the night, cantering sure-footed along the path that led to the moors, the cornfields rushing past in silver and gold. I gripped on with my legs and held tight to his mane, only needing to direct him with a lean to the left or right. I'd been riding Merlin ever since I was able to walk, and we could very nearly read each other's thoughts. Before long, the fields turned to open spaces, and the road dissolved into sheep trails. The ground grew springy as Merlin's hooves tramped the bracken and moss. I breathed in the sleepy smell of heather and the sharp night smells of hare and fox. From the sea the fog rolled in, hiding the path underfoot, slowing our pace. We walked until the shape of Direspire Hall jutted out of the surrounding moorland, its black edges jagged against the fog. It was as out of place as a buzzard nesting among sparrows. The salt smell of the sea blew towards us from the cliff edge. In my throat, fear caught like a burr. Using the walls of Direspire Hall as a marker, I found my bearing. I knew there were badger burrows to the south side of Direspire, large enough for a dog to bolt into if she was scared enough. I kept the grey walls on my left. I'd never seen the lights on in the windows of the manor house. No twitch curtain or silhouette against the glass panes. It looked abandoned, with ivy clinging to the walls like cobwebs. I imagined the dead, empty windows alive with eyes, watching me approach in the dark. I thought of the letter in my pocket, feeling silly now. I would never be brave enough to knock on the door and ask for a job. As we moved closer, Merlin twitched his ears back and forth, listening to sounds too far away or too low for my ears. He snorted, tossing his head and pulling on the reins. The towers and turrets of Direspire Hall jutted towards the night sky. Each part of the great building seemed to twist and turn in different directions at every opportunity. The tallest turret scraped the low cloud that always hung over the hall. I didn't think I'd ever seen clear skies over Direspire Hall, not even in summer. There was always a scrap of grey that clung to the turret like a ragged cloth caught on barbed wire. Surrounding Direspire Hall were imposing walls. They were a snarl of bared teeth that bit into the soft moorland. Despite the tingling fear in my blood, I longed to peek over the walls to see what creatures might be there. On the other side of Direspire lay the sea. The sea, the one that bordered our part of the world, wasn't like any other. It had a mind of its own. Ma said it had eyes and ears and even teeth, and that it would gobble you up if you weren't careful. But to me, the sea and the moors were free. With the farm behind me, I felt lighter, light enough that the wind could pick me up and carry me away, and I half wished it would. I might end up where no other human had been, where adventure was. I was so engrossed in my thoughts that I almost lost my balance when Merlin stopped suddenly. He nervously trotted to either side, as if unsure of his next step. "All right, I'll walk with you from here." I slipped off his back, landing in the soft moss. "Let's see what we can find." I wasn't afraid of the dark or the moorland, but my heart pounded in my chest as the wind whipped my hair and tugged at my clothes like impish ghosts. Overhead, clouds gathered, snuffing out the stars one by one. It smelled like rain was on the way. I had to hurry. I was alert to every sound, scanning the expanse of heather and bracken for a flash of white that would mean Maisie was nearby. I knew this was close to where I had once found a large abandoned badger burrow last summer, while picking bilberries with Ma. If Bill had kept away from Direspire Hall, he wouldn't have stumbled upon it. Maisie might be lost inside. "Come on, Merlin, not far now," I encouraged the old horse. We walked a sheep trail that curved around Direspire Hall, following the grey walls at a distance. I whistled with my thumb and index finger 3 sharp notes, then listened. There was an answering howl, so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. I whistled again. This time I was sure I heard it. "This way, Merlin!" The moors are where the sheep graze among the wild creatures, becoming half wild themselves. The open space is where you'll find the prey and the hunters, the birds and the burrowers. Ice-cold air nipped my ankles, making me shiver. Whistling again, I stopped and listened. A yelp from nearby, weak but undeniable. It was a dog, not a fox or a badger, but a frightened dog, lost and alone. "Maisie!" I shouted out, and the yelping grew into a frenzy, urging me closer. I spotted the dark mouth of a badger burrow. "Maisie?" I called down. I was rewarded by a small pink nose and a howl of gratitude. Pushing aside the brambles, I lay on my stomach and reached into the hole. A bundle of wriggly fur and slobbering tongue greeted me, making me laugh in delight. She was caught in a tangle of briars, their thorns embedded in her thick coat. "Hold on, Maisie." With my pocket knife in one hand, I leaned into the burrow and very carefully cut the briars. "Hold still." With a slice of the knife, Maisie was free, and I pulled her out of the hole. She squirmed into my lap, knocking us both over. "You silly pup, you had us worried." Relief flooded through me as Maisie's warm breath melted against my cheek. She was alive and safe. "Come on, Maisie, let's take you home." Guiding Merlin over to a tree stump, I hauled Maisie onto his back, then climbed on myself. Maisie was a small dog, and Merlin was not easily daunted, so it didn't take long until Maisie and I were settled comfortably on his back. "Well done, Merlin." My heart swelled with pride for the old horse. The fortress-like walls of Direspire Hall were now on my right side, obstructing my view of the sea, even though I could still hear the waves lashing down on the rocky shoreline and smell the salt and seaweed. Merlin was skittery now, leaping to the left, as if the path was blocked by invisible enemies. He seemed to want to keep as much distance between us and Direspire Hall as possible. His nerves set mine alight, and I tried hard to stop myself from starting at every shadow and sound. The wind began to pick up, buffeting us from every direction. "Whoa, Merlin," I soothed through chattering teeth. Suddenly, thunder rumbled across the sky. I felt a prickling of rain on my face. The moor was illuminated by a flash of blinding light, followed by another drum roll of thunder. Merlin whinnied, a shriek that shattered my courage into pieces, and backed away from the path. "Hold still, Merlin. Calm down, home isn't far." I gripped hold of the reins. I guided Merlin back onto the trail for the umpteenth time. "Keep to the path, Merlin, otherwise we'll get lost on the open moor." I tried to keep some calm in my voice. Then I heard what Merlin must have been listening to all along, a sound I had heard before, a groan that brought to mind a sinkhole opening up or a cave crumbling in on itself, rattling my bones and almost frightening me off Merlin's back. "Whoa, boy!" I soothed the horse. Maisie shivered and cowered against me, pushing her face under my armpit. I clutched her to my chest. The groan sounded again, twisting itself into a growl that made me feel hot and then cold before stretching itself into a wail, so taut I felt I could have cut myself on the keen edge. Merlin tossed his head and reared, with Maisie pressed to my chest. I lost my balance and slipped off his back, crashing to the ground with a thump. Maisie squirmed out of my arms and shot down the path towards Bill's cottage, Merlin close behind. They disappeared into the darkness, leaving me clutching my sides and gasping for air. Checking to see if I'd broken any bones, I cautiously stood up. Well, that's not brilliant, Cora, I scolded myself. The prickle of rain turned into a downpour, soaking through my jumper. With a lightning storm, I knew better than to go wandering out onto open moors. Direspire Hall stood next to me. Surely it would be safe enough to shelter from the storm as long as I was outside the grounds themselves. I didn't have much other choice. I pressed against the walls and waited for the storm to pass. Chapter 4. Howling at the Sky. I must have fallen asleep, because it was the chirping of a skylark that woke me. Although I was still damp from the rain, the early morning sun was warm. A pebble suddenly landed on my lap. Puzzled, I picked it up. I couldn't see where it had come from. I looked up to find that I'd taken shelter near a stone archway. Beneath the archway, heavy metal gates were closed shut. Elaborate curls and spirals of metal rusted brown, with overgrown buddleia reaching through, their purple and red flowers attracting butterflies. Through the bars, all I could make out were oak trees and a tangle of briars, with a path that curved to the right and out of sight. A redwing called out a furious warning, a harsh yak, 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 before the tiny bird whirled away into the dense woodland. A boy, about my age, with a dirty face and blonde hair that stuck right up, watched me from behind the gates. "Hello," said the boy, and grinned through the bars, showing 2 rows of crooked teeth. "I've been throwing pebbles at you, trying to wake you up. You was snoring." Who was this? Direspire Hall had been closed to the public for years. Could this boy be a part of the Cavendish family? The boy hopped from one foot to the other, as if the ground was hot coals. He reminded me of a frog, with big, pale blue eyes. "I'm Griff. I'm the gardener here," he said. That would explain the streaks of mud across his face, I guessed. I'd thought the only person working here was the man with the dour face at the market. Griff looked no older than me, but I had never seen him in school. He bounced from one foot to the other. "What were you doing sleeping outside in the storm? What's your name? Do you live nearby?" The questions rained down and my voice jammed in my throat. I took a step back. Griff's eyes went wide. "Don't leave." He looked so crestfallen that I stepped forward again. I wanted to ask him about the creatures inside Direspire Hall. Sometimes it was easier to communicate without words. Thinking of the strange noises I heard the night before, I took a deep breath and howled at the sky. "Ow!" When I had finished, I paused for breath and looked at Griff to see whether he would laugh at me like the kids at school. He was gaping at me. "That was brilliant!" He cupped his mouth and howled, his head thrown back. "Oh!" I burst out laughing. Griff was almost as good at creature noises as me. "My name is Cora," I said, and he nodded. "Pleased to meet you, Cora," he said. There was something likeable about Griff. Maybe it was the surprise of finding someone my age here at Direspire Hall after being warned to avoid the place for so long. If Griff was here, it surely couldn't be as dangerous as everyone said. Griff kicked at the gate, making it clang. "If I had the keys, I'd let you in and show you the creatures." "Oh, I would love that!" My arms prickled with goose pimples at the thought of seeing the Direspire creatures. He thought for a moment. "Maybe there is a way. Last time I checked, Lady Cavendish was in her study, and Mr. Johnson, he's the butler, was in the library. I could sneak you in if you promised to be quiet and careful." My heart leapt into my mouth. "I promise." Griff pointed left to the gate, further into the woods behind the wall.
There's a tree growing against the wall that overlooks the gardens. If you can climb the tree, you can jump onto the shed roof below. It's a bit of a drop, but you should be fine." He raced off without waiting for my answer. A tickle of trepidation started at the base of my spine and zinged all the way up my back, but I ignored it. I wasn't going to let it stop me from seeing the creatures. The twisted tree was easy to spot. It grew in a snarl against the grey bricks of the wall, its root cracking the foundations like nothing was going to stand in its way. This is your chance to change your mind. You could run home and no one would be any wiser. "Cora!" A small voice hissed over the wall. "Do you think you can climb over?" "I think so." The tree looked frighteningly high now that I was standing right underneath it. I tightened the straps on my backpack. The first branch was easy enough, but I couldn't keep the wobble out of my legs as I climbed higher. "Don't look down," I heard Griff say, which meant that I looked down immediately. The ground rolled like the sea. Digging up all the courage I could find, I pulled myself up to the height of the wall. I glanced up at the peak of the towers, just visible through the tall trees. Direspire Hall really did look like a hawk nest built among the trees. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to step out into thin air. The air smelled like the lost parts of a forest, where leaves were left to rot and trees could grow where they pleased. With my heart in my mouth, I leaped from the tree onto the stone wall. Perched on the wall, I clung on with both hands, my legs dangling into the shadows below. "That's it! You're almost over!" Griff grinned from the ground, looking as small as a mouse. He stood next to a wooden shed. I hauled myself into a crouching position. "What do I do now?" "You'll have to jump onto the shed. It's safe, I think," Griff called out. "Go on, Cora." I pushed off and landed heavily on my feet on top of a wooden roof. I took a second to catch my breath. Then the enormity of the situation hit me. I was in Direspire Hall, the place that everyone spoke about in hushed whispers. Ever since I'd been small, I'd been warned about the place, but that had only made me want to see over the walls even more. Now, those warnings nipped at me. Swinging my legs over the shed roof, I dropped to the ground and looked around. The walls were less intimidating once you were inside, with tall trees obscuring swathes of them. There was a stillness, without the wild winds of the moors battering me from either side. "Come on," said Griff, and he started walking. I followed Griff up the driveway, through the cluster of ancient oak trees. The grounds opened up, and I caught my breath. A field filled with unruly rows of flowers like tulips, roses and carnations spilled from their beds and grew even in the cracks of the drive. Bees and butterflies swarmed in brightly coloured clouds. It was wild and muddled and wonderful. "I've tried to imagine what it would be like inside," I told Griff. "From outside the place always looked abandoned." "It does look a bit untidy, but Lady Cavendish says she can't get anyone to help with the upkeep of the place. No one wants to work at Direspire Hall, only Mr. Johnson and me and Ma." Griff ducked behind an oak tree and I followed, so that we were both hidden from view of the house. "I haven't met anyone my own age since we arrived. It's nice to be able to talk to someone who's not bossing me around." Griff was unlike the other children at school. He was being nice to me for one thing. Maybe that was only because he was desperate for company, being stuck behind the walls of Direspire Hall, but still, he was going to show me the creatures. I followed behind as he hopped and skipped through the long grass. "Will you get in lots of trouble if they find out you've helped me sneak in?" I asked. Griff nibbled on his thumbnail. "We'll be really careful not to get found out." That meant yes, I thought. Staying doubled over, Griff crept along behind a tall hedge and I copied him. Then I stopped, my eyes catching on something extraordinary. "Is that a fountain?" I gasped. In the middle of the path,
there was a muddy pond with a statue of a winged horse rearing up on its hind legs with hooves that clipped the sky, streaked with green algae. I'd never seen anything like it. Griff tugged me back towards the hedge.
Yeah, but it hasn't worked for years.
He shook his head at me.
You're going to have to be more careful. We can't let anyone see you.
We followed the hedge that wound around Direspire Hall. There's an orchard, I exclaimed, spotting the gnarled limbs of apple trees and the white flowers of a pear tree in the distance, just like the ones we had on the farm. From a row of beehives came a low drone.
Keep your voice down.
Griff picked up his pace. I ran to catch up with him. The building is so much larger than it looks from outside the walls, I said, craning my neck to look up at the highest turret. It was the grandest house I'd ever seen, yet it had a dishevelled feel to it, like a duke who'd lost his reading glasses. As always, the clouds hung low above us. I spotted a wood nearby, where the trees were so tall that the tops of them disappeared into the clouds, their silvery leaves appearing to melt into the haze. They grew on the side of the grounds nearest the sea cliff, hidden behind the bulk of Direspire Hall, which is why I must have never noticed them before. I've never seen trees like those, I said, pointing to them. They're so tall.
End of CD 1.